Next up, we're very fortunate to have our Director of Product Design from Dublin, Mr. Emmet Connolly, with us. It's the 1940s, and on tiny little islands all throughout the South Pacific, some of the last hunter-gatherer societies on Earth are living fairly primitive tribal lives. Until one day, when huge boats arrive on their island, and white men emerge, and they start building huge paths across the fields. Then giant metal birds come and they land on the paths, and the men start unloading massive boxes of cargo, food, weapons, equipment, tools, and so on. Amazing new technologies just flood the island. These were US military troops landing. World War II was spreading across the whole South Pacific, and the Americans were establishing military bases to combat the Japanese. But the islanders knew nothing of this broader theater of war. To them, it simply appeared that these strange visitors first engaged in some bizarre ritualistic behavior, marching about and building these strange monuments, and then deliveries of amazing goods just arrived. So the war ends and the troops leave. And with them, the flow of goods dries up. So what are the islanders to do? Well, they do the obvious thing, or at least what seemed like the obvious thing to them. They set about recreating the conditions that they had just witnessed that brought about success. They themselves dig long airstrips into the dirt, and they build control tower huts out of bamboo and full-scale replica airplanes out of sticks and twigs, and then they wait for the goods to arrive. Of course, the goods never do arrive for reasons that are obvious to us, or from the outside at least. Simply emulating the conditions that you witnessed that brought about some form of success isn't necessarily going to bring about a repeat of that success. Or in other words, just doing what you see working for somebody else isn't necessarily going to work for you. So that's why I'm a little hesitant to give you too much really explicit advice here. Instead, I'm going to tell you some of the things I've learned or come to realize while putting together the product design team at Intercom, which I found was a tricky thing to even get started on. I mean, where do you go to find out what happens behind closed doors in all these other companies that we all admire that create great products? You can't really just look to your peers in the industry, because they're all going to tell you pretty much the same thing. They're all going to tell you that they are killing it, that they're crushing it, that they're changing the world, so on. I don't know, I just can't read another Medium post about our amazing design journey towards perfection, when for us, it seems like some days we're struggling just to get the basics right. The truth, of course, is a little different. The truth is that these people are actually just lying to you. Or more accurately, maybe they're post-rationalizing their design decisions, and they're leaving out all the bad shit that happened along the way. I have been fortunate enough to work on what I think are some of the best design teams in our industry, actually, and I can tell you that the actual truth is that behind closed doors, each and every one of them, without exception, was a shit show. It was just a mess. Yet nobody seems to be writing Medium posts about how after months of toil and confusion and despair and dead ends and infights and exhausting efforts, we're just relieved to get this compromised piece of shit out the door and move on with our lives. I would read the posts, don't get me wrong, but no one's writing them. But it is genuinely a problem. We do only get to see like the last, 5% or so of each other's work. We just get to see the output. So that's the first thing. Anyone who tells you that everything is perfect beyond what you can just see is probably just lying to you. Because certainly in this world that we work in, nothing really stays perfect for too long. And the reason I say that is because the defining characteristic of startups is progress. It's this ongoing change and evolution and growth and improvement and so on. And all these things are good, they're signs of success, but if your environment is constantly changing, then it stands to reason that the way that you work within that environment needs to constantly change and adapt too. So the truth is that as soon as you have solved a problem, unfortunately, you haven't really solved that problem at all. You've simply unlocked the next new level of problems that are now available to you. Which sounds kind of disheartening maybe at first, but honestly, once I made peace with this, things got a lot easier. It is okay, not knowing the answer to everything. It's okay knowing you're going to have to iterate your way along, or that there's no such thing as just being done. It occurred to me that it's not unlike being a designer. You have an idea of something that's going to work, you put it out there, but then you observe and you iterate and you repeat that process on an ongoing basis. So really, for me, all of this stuff is about progress. From the individual level to the team level to the company level, and even, I would suggest, more broadly at the level of this thing that all of us here are doing collectively together, this thing we're working on called technology. What do I mean by that? Well, the title of this talk is Design in Interesting Times. It's kind of a take on the old Chinese expression, may you live in interesting times. And if you've heard that expression, you probably know that it's actually meant as more of a curse than a blessing. The idea being that interesting times are generally filled with strife and change and massive upheaval. But let's face it, we do live in interesting times. I am sure many of you have looked out the window and noticed that there's a lot of crazy shit going on down there in 2017. And technology has got a big part to play in this. There's no way that you can consider all of this change and upheaval that is happening out there in the world today and somehow just think that design or technology are completely separated from them. In fact, I think a lot of the problems that we are seeing out there today are because change is happening at this rate with which society just can't keep up. We have all these 19th century institutions that are really struggling to cope with these 21st century problems that are being thrown at them by this connected, complex, fast-moving world. So what are we seeing? We're seeing traditional journalism struggle to adapt to this concept of news in the age of Facebook. We're seeing our weather systems start to go haywire as a result maybe of this globalized trade system that we've built. We see nations almost tearing themselves apart. The planet is becoming more connected, but somehow countries are becoming more divided. So technological progress is good, but it also creates instability and it increases complexity. Or as a wise man once put it, yeah, makes you think. But it's true, he has a point here at least. He has a point. It does feel like it's getting harder than ever just to keep up. It does feel like things are speeding up all of the time. Why is that? Well, let's take a look at the way that the world has changed over long periods of human history. This is going to be a slight simplification, so bear with me. But for a long time, not a lot happened. There just wasn't a lot going on. For many millennia, humans lived as hunter-gatherers, much like those islanders that we saw. But the notion of progress wasn't really a thing that people had to contend with. But then a chain of events started to unfold. About 10,000 years ago, the agricultural revolution allowed hunter-gatherers to settle into villages, and a lucky few people got to spend less time on subsistence living and more time on other pursuits, and as a result, some of them invented new stuff. Fast forward to about 2,000 years ago, things are still moving along pretty slowly, but over many centuries, paper and gunpowder and printing emerge. Now it's the 1700s. The steam engine is the animating force behind the Industrial Revolution. Factories and trains are now possible. We're starting to pick up some speed. 1800s, electric batteries, photography, refrigeration, the internal combustion engine, bicycles, plastic, dynamite, telephones, light bulbs. We're moving faster now. 1900s, airplanes, the assembly line, television, jet engines, the atomic bomb, microwaves, transistors, computers, solar power, nuclear power, satellites, microchips, lasers, human spaceflight, the internet, cloning, Google, Things are moving faster than at any point in human history, all the way up to today. Smartphones, AI, self-driving cars, Tinder, I guess. Whatever is going to come next, we are now careening along at a pace never really before experienced in the history of humanity. Whereas before, step changes seemed to take millennia, now it seems to be happening like every year or so. We've achieved exponential growth, this famous hockey stick effect. And there are all sorts of knock-on results. Now, in general, we do consider these up and to the right charts to be kind of good. We talk about them, right? For example, here is what global GDP has looked like since the Industrial Revolution, which led to world population going up in a similarly massive way. And so world energy consumption goes up, which leads to global CO2 levels going through the roof, which relates to the number of species going extinct. So clearly, some of these things are good, but some of them are bad. But I don't think it's a coincidence that all of these charts look pretty much the same. I'm not saying they're causal directly, but they're definitely all connected. Exponential change in one area, particularly it seems in technology, tends to trigger these second-order exponential changes in all sorts of other areas that we just never have predicted in advance. It almost seems to be like some kind of inherent property of technological progress. Okay, let's bring it back down to earth a little bit. Here is one final chart. This is Intercom's growth as measured by annual recurring revenues. So this gladly is one of those good news charts. But let's remember the lesson that we just learned. This innocuous-looking little white line here is going to cause all sorts of knock-on dramatic changes, at least for those of us inside of Intercom. And in fact, as you've heard from some of the talks here tonight, it already is, right? Growth unlocks all sorts of good things, new people joining and more teams and more stuff we can build, but it also brings along feature requests and bugs piling up and inconsistencies appearing in the product. In fact, for most companies that follow this kind of nominal path of success, the default path for the product is towards complexity. The more you progress along this path, the more moving parts that you need to manage internally, the more difficult it becomes for everybody to just stay in sync. So people start to make decisions that are independently excellent, rational decisions, but taken as a whole, lead the product in all sorts of inconsistent, different directions. Let me give you a quick, real example. We use emoji across our products in Intercom, sometimes as a way for users to react to an announcement, maybe as a way to rate an article, to give feedback on a conversation, or even to interact with a bot. So lots of different ways. But in each of these cases, there's a subtle difference in the treatment here. Sometimes there's a caption, sometimes there's not. Sometimes when you click, you get a follow-up action, sometimes not. Sometimes it's in a card, sometimes not. Now, taken in isolation, these are all relatively simple, small problems, no big deal. But when you scratch away at this, now we have 4 different code bases to maintain. That's going to mean 4 times as many bugs that we have to manage. If one of these teams wants to make a change, they're going to have to go and try and talk with all the other teams. In reality, that's probably not going to happen, so things are just going to diverge even further. So the real problem here is more of a death by 1,000 cuts type situation when you really multiply this out. If we let this slide, before we know it, the entire product is going to be riddled with inconsistencies. It's going to be confusing and difficult to use. So clearly, there is some kind of relationship here between progress and complexity. And I don't think this is just about emoji buttons. This is a relatively trivial example. But again, I believe that this trend applies in general to technology and the wider world. As things speed up and get more complex, they somehow start to break down. That's not to say we should just give up and we should just accept this. So now the question becomes, how do we break out of this pattern? And my short answer to that is that we need to get really, really good at thinking in systems, thinking in systems. So here's one more little story to explain what I mean by that. In the 1930s, a truck driver called Malcolm McLean had a problem. His problem was that every time he reached a port, it would just take hours to unload all the bags and boxes and crates from his truck and pull them onto the port side and then haul them onto the ship and arrange them and repeat. And especially at larger scales, this was just incredibly messy and inefficient and slow. So Malcolm had an idea. His idea was to design a system. He designed a system of trucks with standard metal containers that could be removed from the back of the truck, standard portside cranes that could pick them up and drop them into the hull of standard ships that could arrange them so they were optimized for space. And crucially, he made those standards available royalty-free to the entire world, kind of effectively open sourcing them, because he knew that key to the success of his system was that it would be adopted as widely as possible. Malcolm McLean had invented containerization. The cost of moving goods globally was reduced, in some cases by more than 90%, which of course unlocked all sorts of new advances in global trade. And this is why we can have blueberries in January, or at least we can in Ireland. And it's also why you can have an iPhone. You know, this system changed the world that we live in. Building software can, of course, often feel inefficient, like that big pile of crates on the dockside. Especially as projects get bigger, they become more difficult to manage. So people like you building software have come up with ways of tackling this. One example is the service Docker. Engineers have this problem that to move their code from one environment to the other, you know, both environments would often have different dependencies, so when they would move the code, it would just break when they moved it. And the Docker solution is actually a bit like shipping containers. Instead of moving all of the contents and just hoping things don't break, you move the entire self-contained environment. It's simpler and it's quicker, and you just don't have to keep a million things in your head all at once. You could similarly think about object-oriented programming as just being a way of modularizing code into manageable chunks that you can hold in your head at once and that they're easy to reuse. And in all of these cases, Malcolm McLean and Docker and object-oriented programming, the solution is to establish a system. Having a reliable, standardized system allows us to abstract ourselves away from all of those messy details and zoom out to a level of granularity that we can actually just deal with and feel comfortable with. So this raises the question, or at least it does for me, how can we apply some of these principles to the problems that we have in the product design world? What might some form of object-oriented design look like? Well, a bunch of people in the industry are figuring that out right now. And design systems is an emerging way of thinking about building products in a much more modular, abstracted kind of way. In some sense, design systems have been around for many years, starting with the development of visual templates for signage that allowed people to build, you know, a whole family of visual elements without having to start from scratch each and every time. And several years ago, people building websites kind of adopted this idea and came up with reusable templates of UI widgets so you could very quickly knock together consistent UI. By the way, if engineers love their shipping container analogies, designers really, really love their Lego analogies. These templates are a bit like building with Lego bricks, right? You don't have to design every part from just a blank canvas each and every time. Instead, you can just grab a bunch of these pieces and stick them together. So you could take a title and a search box and put it together and say, hey, there's our header, right? But as we saw with the Intercom emoji example earlier, simply having a common set of blocks to work with isn't quite enough. You can still take all those individual blocks and put them together in all sorts of messy, inconsistent ways. It's entirely possible for all of the buttons on your product to have beautifully consistent rounded corners, but your product as a whole to still be a total mess. So what if we take this idea a little bit further? And that's what we have been trying to do with our design system at Intercom. we've tried to take this idea further by actually capturing the meaningful parts of Intercom and encoding them as objects that we can use to build our designs. What that actually means in practice is that designers don't just have, say, a sketch template of buttons and headings. Instead, they have templates of like intercom stuff, conversations and articles and customers and messages. These are things that hold meaning within the actual product. They're not just abstracted UI widgets. And what is more, we have code snippets that can be used to easily and quickly render those same objects. And we have precise language that we use to refer to them, and our help docs refer to them in all the same way. So we have the same concepts flowing through almost from code to customer, and everything is actually just a lot simpler to manage as a result. So even as things speed up and more people join, the conversation stays fairly simple. When we talk to each other, there's not a lot of confusion, not a lot of ambiguity. Designers don't need to keep up with every single detail of what every other designer is doing all across the product. They just need to get familiar with the system of objects and trust that they can use them in their own designs. Relatively speaking, we are still a fairly small company, and trying to build multiple products at once, some would say, is a little bit crazy of an undertaking. So we are probably prime candidates for everything to just fall apart and become this kind of huge, incoherent mess. And that is why this design systems approach, I feel, is key to our potential success. Now, I should say I wouldn't be staying true to the spirit of the event if I stood here and claimed that we have nailed all this and it's all working perfectly. This is very much a work in progress for us, but that is okay. In some sense, it's never going to be done, and that is okay too. That seems to be the way that progress works. Okay, I want to leave you with two simple things. The first is like a statement. You should think about your product as a system from the very beginning, if you can, and then building a design system around those core product concepts will allow you to keep things nice and simple as you scale. I know that sounds ominously like advice, and I said I wouldn't give any advice, so feel free to just ignore it if you really want to. The other thing is more of a question. Can some of these deep, complicated problems that we see out there in the world today, is there some way that they can be addressed by systems thinking? Like, whether we like it or not almost, everybody in this room is part of an industry that is, I believe anyway, the primary cultural force driving change in the world today. I want to say I love technology, but my suspicion is that technology has also created a whole bunch of problems for us. And I'm not convinced that the solution is just more technology. But I do know that the world doesn't seem to be slowing down. I have gotten all this way without really talking about AI or self-driving cars or whatever it is that is going to come next. But I do know that whatever it is, it's going to involve even more complexity for us to contend with. It's like we are islanders. We are witnessing this technology arrive on our shores with no real understanding of how we're going to manage it. When it comes to managing complex systems, an economist called F.A. Hayek suggested that we should maybe think of ourselves less as craftspeople trying to achieve some very specific outcome, and more like gardeners cultivating an environment within which healthy, sustainable growth can happen. The system isn't rigged against us. We just need to learn how to work with it, how to navigate it, how to tame it and guide it along. Maybe how to be more like gardeners. So, interesting times.